I love how
is.
you caught chapter or verse 8's little inclusion of that word eternal.
Yeah, it's everlasting and eternal. We saw that several times, right? I'm
Mhm.
just reminded, if I could, of where we see that in Galatians 3:29, because yes, we have read Galatians, and it says, "And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise." And it just says that there's an everlasting covenant with Abraham and all of his descendants.
Mhm.
So then, if we belong to Christ, we're a part of that covenant.
That's right.
Okay,
It's amazing. So
it
that means I
does.
get that eternal possession as well.
Yes.
This just as Paul also refers to us being co-heirs in Romans, right?
Hmm.
We're co-heirs with Christ. Co-heirs of what? An heir is someone who inherits. What do you inherit? Not only eternal life like Christ did, but also Christ inherits the land of promise in the same covenant of Abraham, just like you and I are promised. So I love it. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Correct.
And it is an eternal possession, guys. This is why it's such a big deal. And Abraham is like saying, hey, like, are you sure how will I know I'll possess this? Are you sure? Like, it's an eternal promise. That's a big promise for an angel to show up to a man and say, hey, I'm gonna give you this land forever.
It is.
Meanwhile, there's all these other people living in the land. Meanwhile, there's giants there that you can't overcome that are populating and doing wickedness. And you're like, do I want this particular piece of land? Like, so I think it's fascinating. In Genesis 15, he tells him, I'm going to give you the land between the Euphrates and the Nile. So, and this will be an eternal possession, eternal possession. Well, Abraham lived the rest of his life and dies at 176. Did he inherit it eternally? This is what I've asked since I started my channel. No, but Hebrews tells us what was going through Abraham's mind. He knew that eternal possession required resurrection. So this is
Correct.
the promise. He knew that Yahweh was the God of resurrection, the God of the living, who would
Right.
resurrect to those in faith. And this is, of course, in the writings of Enoch everywhere, by the way. So if Jubilees 12 is correct and Abraham had the books of Enoch passed down to him from Noah and Shem, then of course he already knew the promise of the covenant, the promise of the resurrection, and it was a great starting place of faith for him to hear this reaffirmed covenant to him, as I have on screen here, and know that, okay, so I'm in the same promise that was also given all the way to Shem, Noah, Methuselah, Enoch, all those guys, Jared, all those guys, Kenan, all the way back to Adam. So, and this, of course, if you cross-reference some of this and you go to read Jubilees 20, he mentions this blessing of the promise of the covenant extending all the way back to Adam, and that he wants that for Isaac and Jacob as well. So I think it's a beautiful thing.
Me too. Yeah, we see in Hebrews as well when it's talking about how, Abraham, it starts with Abraham and it lists off the whole hall of faith. And then it goes on to say that he died, that it says all of these died without receiving the promises of the covenant, and that apart
That's
from
right.
us, they would not be made perfect. And this was written, 20, 30 years at least after, there in Hebrews, after Christ's death and resurrection. Just goes to show that none of those apostles and disciples afterwards thought that when Yeshua resurrected, he took all of the patriarchs out of Sheol with him up to heaven.
Right. Yeah, they knew better, right? They knew the actual story that was promised to everybody that came before them. And so they knew that it required resurrection on a singular day of all the saints, and that the land of promise would have to come back to the earth because it's been withdrawn from the earth. So
That's right.
yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful promise of the kingdom built right into Genesis 17. And it's here. Like I always talk about, guys, the gospel of the kingdom is in every book of the Bible, and of multiple Bibles and different canons around the world. And so it's also here in Genesis abundantly as we go through the covenant promise to Abraham. So just real quick, as a basic summary of this chapter for those studying at home, Yahweh sent an angel to Abraham when he was 90 years old, and he changed his name from Abram to Abraham. Yahweh reaffirmed the covenant and its promises and requirements to Abraham, right? So this is him making sure he understood the commandments were to be followed. The promise, if you do this in faith, is that you'll get eternal life at the resurrection. You'll get the land of promise that I'm going to give you. Yahweh introduced the eternal instructions of circumcision to Abraham as a part of the covenant requirements. So what are your thoughts on this one real quick, Wes? He offered circumcision. Abraham did it. Everyone in his household, all the men, he did it when he was told to. And do you think this is the first time man circumcised anyone on the earth?
I'd have to say it's probably not the first time. No, it's just the first time it's introduced to us in the, modern American canon, Protestant canon of Scripture. It's really reminiscent of Jubilees 15. All the talking about how if they don't if you don't circumcise the flesh of your sons on the eighth day, on the eighth day, then you've broken my covenant and you're to be cut off. Well, so it just that kind of proposes a bit of a challenge with what we see later on, in the epistles where we have the circumcision party talking with Paul, and that opens up a whole nother can of worms. But yeah, they were trying to say that you're cut off from covenant if you're not circumcised. Well, Abraham was a perfect example of having been in covenant with the Father even before he kind of gives them some of these instructions, and that he doesn't get circumcised until he's 99. He started following him when he was how old? Like
14, according to Jubilees.
Years old. That's right.
Yeah, and he came to faith in Babylon, then went to Haran, then moved down into Canaan, where once he got down into Canaan, there were already people following the Most High God. Do you think they were already circumcised?
It's possible.
Was Adam circumcised when he was taken to the garden after purification days?
I think you'd have to be able to be in the garden.
What about Enoch? When Jubilee says that Enoch was taken into the garden for 300 years to be a scribe and write down the condemnation of mankind leading up to the flood, was he circumcised to be in the Father's house? Does the Father doesn't change? I'm kind of being rhetorical. I think Wes knows this, but the Father doesn't change, guys. He tells us in his covenant that these things are eternal, just like he tells in Genesis 17 to Abraham that this is an eternal instruction. And Jubilees chapter 15:27, which is what Wes already mentioned, it says that the angels in heaven were created from their first day of creation. They were already circumcised because they're ministers in the temple in heaven. They're a part of a priesthood in heaven. You cannot go into the Father's temple and stand before him to have a sacrificial fellowship meal and not be circumcised as a male. And so therefore, this is an eternal instruction from the Creator to all male members of various kinds, mankind and angel kind, that this is an eternal instruction of his Torah. So we see this in Ezekiel 44:7-9, where he's chastising the corrupt priesthood in Ezekiel's day who were allowing priests to come into the temple and minister who had not been circumcised. And then he promises in his house in the future, there will not be anyone that's not circumcised both in flesh and in the heart that comes into his temple. So I think it's a beautiful, beautiful concept. What I see in this is why I mentioned this earlier, I think in chapter 14, when we got to the Melchizedek, Wes, is that I see Abraham is raised in Chaldea and then in Haran with his family. Remember, his father was a general to Nimrod.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not like he didn't come up it tells us in Jubilees 12 that his father told him, look, I know this idolatry thing is worthless, but if I don't do this, the people will kill me. So like even his father knew and was an idol maker and a general to Nimrod and was a very prominent leader in that society. So for them to leave and go to Haran, kind of a big deal. And Abraham is raised in this, guys. He's kind of like, how do I put this? Meanwhile, so think about a map if you could, right? So you got Abraham, he's raised over here around the Euphrates, Mesopotamian, Chaldea area. Meanwhile, down here in the Levant near Bethel, there is already people also from the line of Shem, from different descendants, practicing the ways taught to them by Shem, passed down through Peleg and Ru and all those other guys to Eber, to get us to the place where they know the ways of Yahweh and to keep carrying it on, even with their own priesthood. I promise you they're circumcised, guys. Yahweh's laws do not change. I promise you they've already taught Abraham is being brought along in discipleship according to how the Father thinks he needs to be in the pace that he needs to be. So at this point in Abraham's life, Yahweh's like, all right, I can introduce circumcision to him now. If he'd have been raised under Shem's descendants through Eber, he probably would have already been done as a baby. But he wasn't. He was raised in Babylon. So just like with Gershom and Moses' son, Gershom was being raised in Midian through being born through Zipporah outside of Egypt in the land of Midian. And they weren't following circumcision practices. So, but Moses had been circumcised, and he knew that was an eternal sign of the covenant. And he had to deal with the threat of being killed because he hadn't circumcised Gershom, and Gershom at that point was already 30 years old. So this was a situation where the Father, he's not going to just immediately kill you if you don't do it. Clearly, Abraham was in covenant with the Father for what is that, 80, 84 years, 85 years without being, or 75 years without being circumcised. And then he does it, right? And Yahweh doesn't give him any special extra benefit at that point. He's just saying, this is part of my internal instructions, and now it's time for you to do this part as well. So therefore, just like with Moses and Gershom, Moses had lacked in this area, and he needed to have done this requirement or this instruction. He didn't. And then before he went back to Egypt to lead the people, he needed to be a proper example. So he needed to circumcise Gershom. So this was, it's just these types of things to me is like, it's a beautiful example that the Father doesn't expect you to do it all right, like as a child or the moment that you come into the faith.
In fact, that being said, would you then say that there will be people that will make it into the kingdom that were never circumcised in their mortal flesh?
100%, because at the resurrection, they get circumcised.
That's right. Okay, good. So that's what I was going to get into, is just because a moment ago you alluded to that passage in Isaiah, I believe it is, where it says that nobody uncircumcised, Ezekiel, thank you, nobody uncircumcised will enter into the kingdom, the New Jerusalem, heaven, right? And so people would have a knee-jerk reaction to that if we don't clarify, I think, just because, as we mentioned, that Jubilees 15 does say, and for all the angels of the presence and all the angels of sanctification have been so created from the day of their creation in the context of circumcision, and that in the resurrection, Yeshua says, we will be made like the angels. So even if somebody weren't to have the flesh of their foreskin circumcised in this mortal life, but they are judged righteously still at the resurrection, then they will receive a new body already taken care of for them.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul promises you're going to get an incorruptible body. That means your body's made new, it's incorruptible. And a part of that, having a perfected body, is having a circumcised body. Dare I say it. So this is the promise: at the resurrection, you'll be made like the angels, you will be circumcised so that you can enter the Father's house and have a fellowship meal with him, and there'll be no issue. So it's beautiful. Real quick, finish out this chapter. I think we got 3 more chapters to hit. And basically, Yahweh changes Sarai's name to Sarah, which is interesting. A lot of people have done a Hebrew breakdown on adding the H to Abraham and Sarai, so it's interesting. Also, Yahweh promised Abraham and Sarah they would have a son named Isaac who would continue in Abraham's authority. That is his seed. That's why when you see this reference of this word seed, when it's speaking about Noah's seed, Shem's seed, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob's seed, it's the people that are doing covenant behavior, the commandments. And specifically when it comes to Abraham's authority, his name, his seed is perpetuated on the earth, as both Genesis and Jubilees explain. That means someone that's going to carry on the priesthood for him. So we have a direct promise from the angel in Genesis 17 to Abraham and Sarah: Isaac will pick up your place in the priesthood, your authority. Just as we read at the very beginning in Genesis 12, in verse 2, Yahweh says to Abraham, I will make your name great. I will make your authority great. So this is where he's going to pass on that authority to Isaac. Abraham circumcised himself and all the men of his household. That includes Ishmael, who I believe at this point was 14 years old. So all those men, what kind of conversation do you think that was when all those 318 warriors that he had in his house?
He wants us to do what?
So wait, he's wanting us to do what? Or is it possible that they already kind of knew that there were people that had been circumcised on the earth, because they were already interacting with those priests of the Melchizedek order, right? Earlier, after the war between the kings, right? So it's just,
like you were saying earlier, he doesn't make anybody do anything in blind faith. So it's very possible that he had examples and influence around for them to see, okay, we're not the only ones, I guess. And it wasn't a Zipporah moment where she, thou art a bloody husband to me.
Throwing foreskins at each other and being mad about it. No, they were doing this in obedience, because they were worshiping. All of these guys are following the example of Abraham to do the commandments of God and to love the Lord their God with their heart, soul, strength, and mind. Guys, these people are doing this in a wonderful way. This is a what we would consider a righteous clan of Abraham, right? If I could put on my Scottish voice, these guys were like, they were doing it right. Their tartan was righteousness. These people were trying to do the ways of Yahweh, and they were being commended and blessed financially, spiritually, protected from all their enemies around them. It's not a thing to take a quick snip as a man. I mean,
and Abraham must have been blessed with steady hands.
Steady, the surgeon's hands.